All right. Good evening. I'm going to call to order the Monday, December 17th, 2018 meeting of the Arlington Redevelopment Board, recorded by ACMi. There are a lot of people in a small room this evening, and I'm assuming everyone is here for the first item on the agenda regarding multifamily housing analysis and recommendations. There's going to be a presentation. I would ask that everyone hold their questions until I open a public question and answer period after the presentation has ended and after the board has had a chance to ask questions. I'll let you know when that is. Follow the usual routine through that. Raise your hand, stand up, state your name and address, and keep your comments brief and respectful. Right now, we are just in the beginning phases of this, so I'm going to turn this over to Jenny Raitt, who is going to introduce MAPC and the presentation. Go ahead, Jenny.
All right, thank you. So, good evening, everybody. I'm Jenny Raitt. I'm the Director of Planning and Community Development for the town. And here tonight we have Alexa Smith, who is a Senior Regional Housing Planner with MAPC, Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and Aaron Zwerko, who's the Assistant Director of Planning and Community Development. And I think mostly Alexis, although Aaron may put in a few words as well, will be giving this presentation. We've been working with MAPC for a little over 6-7 months now on this analysis, and I shared with this board the sort of preliminary results of the analysis on October 1st, which is basically to analyze the opportunities that we have to develop along our main corridors in Arlington, which follows along what we want in the master plan, which is greater development along those corridors while thinking about how to preserve and respect neighborhoods. And so the focus of this attention on this particular topic is really about the corridors, and specifically looking at R4 through R7, which are our currently high-density residential districts, and then also looking at some opportunities in the business districts where we currently have mixed-use zoning, to look at ways to increase densities and how to do that. And why? Because that is, again, what we've been trying to do as part of our advancement of the master plan, which was adopted in 2015. It's a way to catalyze new business. It's a way to catalyze and create more vibrancy in places where we want it. I hear very often questions about why our business districts look a certain way or why we can't attract certain types of development even after adopting mixed-use zoning in 2016. So we engaged in this conversation with MAPC. This is one part of many things that we're doing to advance zoning amendments to the bylaw. We engaged in this conversation to start looking at those opportunities and figuring out what we can do to make some changes. So this is one of many different things that people will be seeing coming as proposals that we're recommending. Nothing has changed. Nothing is really what we're doing is we're hearing about the analysis tonight, and then the next steps would be filing a warrant article for town meeting, and then it would go through a public hearing process just so that everybody in the room understands the potential timeline of things. And town meeting is the annual town meeting in April. So where we're at right now, again, is the recommendation. So what's been posted this evening for sharing in terms of material, we posted the memo, which came from Alexa Smith, which basically provided an overview and a summary of what brought us here tonight. And then her analysis, which goes into a little bit more depth behind all of the recommendations. So what she's going to do tonight is walk us through how we got here. It has been informed by discussions with our department, but as well as people who've been serving in a multifamily working group, basically a bylaw working group. We also have a zoning bylaw working group who's been also helping to think about different zoning bylaw changes. So this all precedes work that we did on recodification earlier this year, which was adopted in February. So that's what brings us here tonight. I hope that that gives you a good picture of just a little bit of the history, why we're all in this room. I'm sure there's other reasons why you're in this room. We'll get back to that. I'm going to hand it over to Alexis and I guess to Aaron as well, if there's anything you want to add.
No,
Okay. Thank you.
In that case, I'll get started. Greetings, everyone. Again, my name's Alexis Smith. I'm a senior housing planner with MAPC, and I am thrilled to be here tonight to talk to you about multifamily zoning. As Jenny mentioned, I'm going to get into a little bit of the background of how we got to where we are tonight. And again, to follow up on what Jenny said, I just want to frame this and remind everyone, the zones that we're covering are districts R4 through R7, the higher intensity residential districts, and the business districts, which, as was outlined in the housing production plan and in the master plan, that really is concentrated on Arlington's main corridors. These are the areas where the town has expressed a desire for vibrancy, for supporting the business districts, and for really increasing the number of housing options and the variety of housing options that are available. We've been working on this for about 6 months. In addition to being informed by the housing production plan and master plan goals, we've done a series of analyses, which I'll get into briefly here, and working group discussions. Again, as Jenny mentioned, there's been a lot of thought that's gone into how these recommendations took form. I believe folks on the ARB have seen most of these analyses, so I'm going to run through them relatively quickly. But again, please feel free to follow up with questions. One of the initial things we did was a parcel analysis looking at lot size and density. The goal of this was to understand the extent to which Arlington's existing bylaw to understand the extent to which Arlington's existing development patterns could happen under its current bylaw with regards to lot size and to density. Once we looked at this and we played with a couple of different scenarios to look at how things might change. Unsurprisingly, we generally found that in the business districts, because of some of the amendments that were passed a few years ago, the lots are largely compliant, but in the residential district, there's a pretty high percentage of lots that do not comply currently. Again, we looked at tweaks that could be made to further enable some of the existing development patterns that are happening along these main corridors. We also looked at actual real concrete examples of what these different densities mean, so that we could get a feel for what the numbers mean on the ground in practice, as opposed to just a high level theoretical certain lot square footage per unit. Then we moved on to a build-out analysis. I'm going to run through this really quickly because I believe you've seen this already. But again, we can circle back around if you have questions afterwards. The build-out analyses focused on 4 different sites to look at development potential and to also really understand. It was an iterative layering of the zoning requirements to gain a greater understanding of where the pinch points are in various different zones. So looking at this is one of the 4 example, or one example of the 4 build outs that we did. First, you look at how yards and open space impact what you can build, then layering on height, adding in the height buffer, then looking at floor area ratio and how parking, this is demonstrating that even when you have all the dimensional requirements factored in, then parking is another layer. And looking at what you could potentially build under current zoning, and then looking at a couple of different tweaks that might enable additional density, additional units. Again, all in mind of the goal of the project, which comes out of the housing production plan goals for greater density and diversity of housing options along these main corridors. The working group reviewed all of these analyses at a couple of different points, and we've also had some really great discussions about how these analyses could inform recommendations, which I'm going to jump into now. And again, we can circle back around to questions. I know there's a lot of material here that we're going through tonight, but I want to make sure to leave enough time for discussion. I'm going to cover the recommendations on a high level. There's more detail in the recommendations document that you have, but we'll just cover the main points here right now. Starting off with open space. Based on particularly the build-out analysis that we did, we found that the usable open space requirement is pretty restrictive, and folks in the working group generally felt that this was the usable open space specifically was really geared towards a requirement that you might see in the neighborhoods as opposed to along a main thoroughfare. But we also had a lot of discussions about how folks in town really appreciate green space, and that's an important piece of Arlington's physical heritage. And so our recommendation is to eliminate the usable open space requirement for multifamily and instead double the landscaped open space requirement. That's because landscaped open space is a lot more flexible, and it will allow for just greater flexibility when a developer is trying to build something on a small parcel, while still preserving a fair amount of open space. We're also proposing allowing up to a quarter of that to be satisfied on the roof. Moving on, and again, I'm going to go through these relatively quickly, but we'll come back and discuss. We looked at front and side yards in the R4 through R7 districts. Given that a lot of these districts occur almost exclusively along the main thoroughfares of Mass Ave and Broadway, we found that some of the front and side yard requirements were really rather suburban, as opposed to something that you would want to see on a vibrant main corridor. So we were proposing reducing the front yards. There would still remain a front yard setback, but we're just reducing it a little bit to generally 10 to 15 feet. We're also proposing reducing the side yards in these districts, depending on whether or not the residential property is adjacent to a business district. If it's a business use, then the idea is that we'd create a continuous street wall, which really is a nice pedestrian experience and consistent with Main Street pattern. So that's the second piece. The third piece would be to decrease the minimum lot area and minimum lot area per unit, aka density, in the higher intensity residential districts. The minimum lot area is based primarily on the parcel analysis that you saw. This would enable, there's a lot of residential lots in Arlington where you could build a really lovely fourplex, and you just, on smaller lots, and you just can't do that under the current bylaw. So that was what we had in mind with the minimum lot area, and as opposed to for the minimum lot area per unit. Folks really gravitated towards some of the density examples that we looked at, the photos that I had showed earlier, at a particular 1,000 square foot of lot area per unit. And so in districts where the current requirement was higher than that, we decreased it to be consistent with, again, that was based on the examples, that was a level of density that folks really felt was appropriate for the main corridors. Moving on, we looked at reducing the distance within which the height buffer applies. The height buffer is pretty restrictive. It applies within a pretty large area, and because the districts are so small, in many cases, it effectively reduces the allowable height entirely across the whole parcel. And so we looked at reducing those distances so that there's still a buffer, there's still a fair amount of protection and relief, but it's not effectively reducing the allowable building height across the entire parcel. We looked at increasing the FAR pretty much across most of the higher intensity residential and districts and the business districts. This is generally to enable to allow the lots to take advantage and be consistent with some of these other changes that we're making. We looked at parking. Our proposal is to change the parking ratio to be 1 space per unit, which is what is currently required for single family, duplex, and threeplex housing throughout town. And so this is suggesting that the requirement for multifamily housing would be consistent with that. And finally, we are proposing allowing up to 6 units by right, either 6 units of multifamily or 6 units of mixed-use residential. That's 6 units is still a relatively low threshold, and so we're hoping that it will allow some of these smaller, really lovely 4 or 6 to happen. 6 units is because that's where the inclusionary ordinance kicks in, and so that would allow capture of 1 affordable unit on a project of this size. So that was an incredible amount of information. Oh, and just to follow up on the next steps, as Jenny mentioned, we're looking at moving towards a Springtown meeting, and there'll be a public forum in the new year. So that was a ton of information in a short amount of time, but I'm happy to answer questions and hear your thoughts.
So we'll begin with the board. We'll each have the opportunity to ask questions. I'll turn it over to the public. I sat on this committee as we worked through these analyses and developed these recommendations, and there was care to focus largely on the sliver that runs through town, to focus on Mass Ave, Broadway, and Summer Street, and not to spill into what are traditionally residential neighborhoods. So a lot of these height restrictions and density, potential increases in density won't spill into people living in R1, R2, R3 districts, but to encourage sort of the redevelopment of parts of town where these kind of developments and these kind of properties already exist. So thank you, Alexis. I think it's been eye-opening to see what we've kind of missed the boat on in the last few years, particularly in development along Mass Ave, where commercial space doesn't really suit modern needs. There's a real lack of being able to draw new business into town on any number of levels. So I do appreciate all the hard work that you and the department have put in. So I'll turn it over to Andy now to begin the questions.
Just a couple questions, and I really want to hear the public comment, and then maybe come back. Front yard you mentioned was 10 to 15 feet.
Mm-hmm.
So does that mean you're building on Mass Ave, you have to set back 15 feet all the time,
Depending on the district, but yes.
for the most part?
Mm-hmm.
So
And that's for residential, R4 through R7, or R5
Right.
through R7 in this case.
So, but if you had so it wouldn't be if you had retail on the,
No, I believe the current front yard setback for B districts is 0 for mixed
right,
use, I
right,
should say.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no proposal to
There's no
change
mixed
that.
use
Yeah,
in
and
R4
that's-
to R7.
But that would be only in those mixed-use districts, in districts that allow mixed use. You know, a typical apartment building with a retail at the face.
We're not proposing any changes to the front
Right.
yard setback for mixed use. This would just be for in the R5 through R7 districts,
Right.
single-use residential, which are interspersed with the business districts all along Mass Ave. You could be walking down the street and not and pass three different districts in one block.
Just a reminder of how the zoning map
Yes.
looks.
So we're not proposing any changes to anything that would be mixed use. This would be just for single-use residential districts.
And clarify the height buffer for me. I actually don't understand what that is. Is that a blending of heights between sites, or is that?
It is. I'm gonna skip back to the height buffer. Currently, is a reduced height that takes effect if you are within 100 to 200 feet of an R2 or lower
Okay.
district. And that 100 to 200 feet depends on orientation. If you are,
Okay.
and so 100 to 200 feet, I mean, 200 feet is the size of a small block.
Right, yeah.
And so even if, in this case, in this example, the maximum allowable height is 5 stories, or 60 feet, but the height buffer limit is 40 feet. And so even though the height limit is 5 stories, anything that is within, in this case, 100 feet of the R2 zones, you can only build up to 40 feet.
Got it. That's it for now.
Ken?
I just want to follow up on a few questions that Andy had. So essentially, what we're doing here, we're setting up mixed-use buildings along Mass Ave with potential of retail podium having 0 lot line, and housing, if it's mixed use, if there's housing, it'd be set back about 15 feet back above the retail.
Yes.
Not
Yes.
mixed use.
After a certain
And so,
height.
sorry,
This
so
is
the mixed use, mixed use currently, there is no front yard setback
This
requirement.
is a different animal.
And we're not changing,
Okay.
we're not changing that. We're just saying for a residential only use, the required setback would be 10 to 15 feet.
Okay.
So only if you have residential on the first floor.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry, Pam, hold your
Sorry.
the comments until after.
I'm just trying to understand, we're trying to create sort of a rhythm right now along Mass Ave, and then having these setbacks.
That-
It really kind of, I don't know, I don't see that as an urban edge, okay?
That's a
And-
fair point. We'd struggled with that. I think we had originally come in thinking, these are properties that are almost exclusively along Mass Ave and Broadway. Let's do 0-foot setback. But then after some discussion, the thought was, you know, folks do have, you know, in some cases, maybe that is too much. If we had a 10-foot setback, that would allow room for a bench or some plantings, so we'll go with that. But that was something that we struggled with.
Okay. And then, to get back to what we had before, with the setbacks in the back, if the back of the neighborhood faces a different zoning, so that limits this, the height of the building where it abuts it.
Yes.
But if I look at along the map here, everywhere, everything abuts something different from the back of it.
Exactly.
So I don't see what you're doing here, because that setback just creates this kind of a curve, and you're not going to get anything up there. If the initial response was, oh, let's make it the ability to have 5-story buildings or 4-story buildings, which makes it more inviting for developers or whoever to develop this, so we have more housing stock in those areas. But if you have that kind of steep transition, I just think maybe it's a little too steep, a little too restrictive. I know we have to be careful of what are the neighbors behind it, but when you do that, it eliminates the ability to have anything along Mass Ave back down to 1 or 2 stories again, because it's so tight. I'm not saying what I'm saying is correct. I'm just saying, did we look at both ways? Because I'm just seeing this as such.
They're reducing the buffer.
Yes, but the reduction is so great that it doesn't allow. That one there is a good example because it's a very deep site. Okay, but there's many other sites along Mass Ave that's not as deep. It's only 30 feet. It's only 40 feet.
Right.
Okay, and when you do that, and you have a setback, it doesn't allow you to get up there, because
Right.
when it gets so tight, you can't do it anymore.
So they're reducing it, so it's not,
I know, and I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
you're. I don't know.
they're allowing it to get higher next to lower rise.
You're not allowing it to get high enough, because it's not going to happen, because
You don't have enough space on the lot to begin with.
yes,
Yeah.
because I think one of the things that we notice here is there's a lot of small lots.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, that's
and they're a limiting factor, and that's why I think there hasn't been any growth here. If we're trying to promote growth, what are we doing about that, and how? And I just want to see how we're going to look at that. I don't know. I don't have an answer. I'm just saying we should look at it.
No, that's you're picking on all of the things that we really wrestled with when we were developing these recommendations. One of the reasons why we settled on the 25 to 50 feet as opposed to the current 100 to 200 feet is that there is a rear yard requirement on all of these parcels, and so in most cases the height buffer would overlap with the already required rear yard, which, you know, the building is never going to be able to come up all the way to the back of the
Correct.
lot, and so there is some overlap there. But you're totally correct in that there's a lot of small lots, and the zoning is so scattered that most parcels are many parcels along the main corridors do back up against our lots.
I'm just going to leave it at that.
Yeah. No, thank you.
We'll always talk a little about it later.
David.
I want to talk a little bit about the opposite side of the building, and what you're referring to as the street wall. And I think that's a little bit of an unfortunate term, because I think it evokes something that's maybe the opposite of what we really need when we're talking about it, when we're enhancing. Because we're talking about it in terms of enhancing the pedestrian experience, and talking about a wall does not sound like a very appealing thing. So
That's totally valid. Yeah.
I wanted to just talk a little bit about the ideas relating to the upper story setbacks, and this idea of wanting to have a good pedestrian experience, but balancing that against creating something that feels too much like an urban canyon. And I realize we're only talking about perhaps bringing the third story forward to the building face. But I'd like to make sure that we think that through very carefully, because I think it is only one story more than we allow right now at the building face. But I want to make sure that we're all in agreement about what that's going to make the streetscape feel like and the pedestrian experience feel like. And I do appreciate that it would be very helpful for increasing the density without necessarily increasing the height of the buildings. But I don't want to create a wall where we're talking about the street wall. I want to make sure that it still has the neighborhood feel that we all like about it.
Gene.
Well, I agree with my colleagues, and just want to add to what Ken said is that there are so many different zoning districts along these corridors we're talking about that having different requirements for the R's and the B's on the same street when it might be one parcel right next to each other, to me doesn't make a whole lot of sense if we have a long-term goal of having a consistent, good-looking streetscape. I'm not sure what the answer is, because we certainly don't have that plan. But if we have a goal to try to get that, I'm not sure we're getting that by having different setback and height and other requirements just by sort of a historical accident that one thing might be a B3 and the next thing might be an R5. And this doesn't do anything, I think, toward fixing that. So I think it's worth kicking that back to the committee, I think, to take another look at it. Second, this has to do with the special permit triggers. I know a lot of people say, oh, special permits make it more difficult to get things done, but I wonder how much more difficult it really makes to get things done, and whether we are making the right choice by saying that 6-unit buildings no longer will need special permits. The reason I say that is because we've had some of those buildings come before us, and I think, maybe we'll take a little credit, they were much better after they got done than before they got to us. And I'm a little bit concerned that they're going to be missing an important level of review. Second is some of the requirements in the zoning bylaw kick in when there's environmental design review. One example is bicycle parking, which kicks in if it's subject to environmental design review. If we're taking it out of 6-unit buildings, then we're taking away the bicycle parking requirement. So I think we need to think a little bit more about, is the trade-off really worth it? My initial thought when I read this, and I'd be interested in hearing what other people have to say, is the trade-off's not worth it. And I would keep the special permits at 6 units. Parking. I'm a big proponent of bicycling, a big proponent of public transit, and I'm also really concerned about the proposal for parking. And I guess here's why. There are a lot of reasons why I'm concerned. One relates to the bicycle parking rules, which are predicated on the number of motor vehicle spaces. So if we are reducing the number of motor vehicle spaces, we have to fix the problem that we're reducing the requirement for bicycle parking at the same time, and we need to figure out how to fix that. I am concerned about it, though. I don't think the comparison to you can have only one parking space in a single-family home really holds up, because I have not seen a single-family home be built in Arlington with one parking space. The tear-downs, the buildings in between, they all have 2 or 3 parking spaces. Secondly, single-family homes, and there are lots of exceptions, but most of them still have families where there are kids in the bedrooms. Most of the apartments are not like that. Most of the apartments have adults in most of the rooms. And I mean, that's a generalization, it's not true for all. And they're gonna bring their cars, and I think one of the problems that people see already in Arlington is that apartments are rented to them and they have no place to park their car. They don't have street parking overnight. So I think this would present some real problems because I think the apartments would be built with fewer parking spaces to maximize the number of units. I think maximizing the number of units under some circumstances makes sense, but I think we're making a mistake if we are limiting the parking the way we're proposing to do. I just think there'll be long-term problems for the town in doing it. We have some good public transit, but it's not great public transit. And even if we don't reduce it by right, they can still come in and do all of the other things to get some reductions with the trade-offs. So I'm hesitant about reducing the parking. I wondered, Andrew, if you could help me out. I was trying to figure out by looking at this, and I couldn't do it. Like, what are I understand the benefit is you get some more square footage, but from a streetscape point of view, what are we gaining and losing by doing something like this?
So let Alexis walk through that analysis. It is something that we went over in committee.
We did, yeah, we had a discussion about that as well. I think the, oh,
I could.
oh,
Put it
yeah,
right now.
sure.
Okay.
I mean, I think the rationale for that was 3 stories is a pretty appropriate height for Mass Ave. It's actually pretty safe for Mass Ave, I think, in terms of just general, the width of the street is so wide, and it's a street that can handle a little bit of height at the street front. Just in terms of the proportion of the building, I think that 3 stories works really well, and we were talking about that pedestrian experience and feeling like you're on a vibrant corridor. I think 3 stories really accomplishes that. In addition to, you know, the advantages of being able to fill out the units at that level. But that is something that we did go back and forth on. Y'all are hitting on all of the main things that we had big discussions about.
In the design show here, let me see it. Oh, there it is. There's still a setback. If there's only 3 stories, would there be no setback? Would it just end with the flat wall going up for 3 stories and end?
Yes.
Or would there have to be a setback if it was only 3 stories?
If it was only 3 stories, currently there's no setback required, and so that would remain the same.
Okay.
But currently, the setback, if the building is 3 stories, there's no setback required, but if it is greater than 3 stories, then there is a setback required at the 3rd story. So
you're just saying
it's a variable
so
whether.
you just make it 1
So
story.
yeah, so this is just saying, just make it a consistent 3 stories, and then anything above that, do a setback. It's making it a little more uniform.
Go ahead.
Gene, to answer you,
Yeah.
I just want to add to your thing. I think by having it up front of the street, what's the difference between the 2? I think the one on the right gives more square footage to have ability to have more street life, because there's more activity going on now along that urban edge. I'm not going to use the word wall. Okay. And that gives you more opportunity to support that urban edge. That's what I see. What is the major difference? Because when I look at the streets right now, there are a lot of smaller shops that are closed, they're not open, and there's not enough life and activity there. We were trying, I think this is a good way of help supporting that life there. I think all of us want to see this kind of nice, lively street there.
One of the spots in town we kept coming back to in this discussion was Capitol Theater, Capitol Square block. And you have a pretty high density block there where there is always some activity for exactly the reasons that you just stated. It's a nice, well-maintained building that's been kept up. It's appropriate for the commercial use that's in there. It has housing and office space above. And it's the kind of thing that people in town really respond well to and would like to see more of. So it's the model that we've been using as we walk through these things to allow for a little bit more height, playing with setbacks, allowing for setbacks above stories and moving on.
But these regulations have to do with residential at the ground floor. These are all about.
They do, and they, yes, they do.
So I'm just kind of focusing in this discussion. I think we do need to look at what mixed-use districts are that allow that, because we all look at that and say, oh, that's the retail at the ground, it looks good. But that isn't what we're talking about in these regulations.
Right.
That would be.
This would apply to both mixed use in the B districts and residential in the higher intensity residential districts.
Except that you'd need a 15-foot setback, 10 to 15-foot setback if it was.
Yes, true.
Yeah.
If it was not in the mixed-use district.
Mhm.
Yep. But you could do a mixed use in the business
Mhm.
district.
You could do a mixed use in a business district, okay, so I think it would be good to have an analysis in there, almost like the map that you showed at the beginning. Because we've always thought about, wow, that Capitol Theater area is great, it looks dense, you go to it, there are restaurants,
Mhm.
you get that experience that's very different from the areas in between,
Mhm.
which are more residential, though they can still have a little more density, I would agree. And then it returns to mixed use in some areas. So Mass Ave kind of flows in and out of a more residential feel, albeit more dense than the low density neighborhoods,
Mm-hmm.
back to a more mixed use feel. And I think that's probably a good thing, but we kind of, I think Ken hit on this a little bit too, the missing tooth feel if this is kind of going back and forth.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And not a good thing, so I could see it being analyzed a little bit together, so we can
Yeah, Jean
understand.
made that point as well. I think that's
Yeah.
something that we'll take back to the committee to look
Okay.
at.
I think, well, I'll speak for myself. I think adding some density to town is a good thing. It has a lot of benefits to the town. To me, the question is, how do we do it well? And how do we do it that it works for all of us who live to the town and all of us who are going to be moving, all the people who are going to be moving to the town. The open space suggestion to eliminate the usable open space for multifamily and mixed use and increase the landscape open space requirement. I was thinking about that, and I was wondering whether you could just say it has to be some combination of usable and landscaped open space that adds to the total map, rather than choosing one or the other, because that would give the developer, and if he came to the ARB, for example, more opportunity to talk about what worked in a particular site. And so I just wonder whether it makes sense to just eliminate usable and instead give them a choice. They must hit a certain number, but it could be some combination of usable and landscape open space, because they may want to do so much on the site.
I think landscaped doesn't preclude it being usable. Landscaped open space still allows terraces and grassy areas and patios.
Right.
I think I'm not sure if that gets.
Well, except that the definition, well, I don't have the definition. The definitions seem to be a little bit exclusive between
Okay.
the two.
Yeah,
And I'm
we'll
not
take a
sure
look at that.
you want to do that. I'm
We'll take a look
also,
at
I mean, I know there are some circumstances now when we can allow open space on balconies and roof decks. I'm not sure if there's a real advantage to increasing that as of right, so I want to sort of hear why that makes sense as opposed to the current system
The
that
current
allows it sometimes.
The current system effectively doesn't really. It's almost. It would be almost impossible to happen under the current system. The current bylaw allows you to do it only if the roof is one story above the lowest residential story. So it effectively could only happen if the building was only 2 stories tall, assuming a first ground floor of mixed use or of retail and then a second story of residential. Anything above that, you'd be too high above the lowest residential floor. So even though technically it is permitted in the bylaw, I can't. I have a hard time imagining a situation in which it would actually happen in practice. So the idea behind this was to enable it to actually happen.
coming back to Jean's point about the special permit trigger, I agree that this board has been able to add value to projects even as small as 6 units, and to engage in productive discussions with the applicants. And in some cases, through those discussions, we've been able to reduce the amount of parking, increase the amount of open space available, and make significant improvements to the bike parking and pedestrian access to the sites, again, by having the discussions with the applicants during the permit and hearing process. And so I'm also hesitant to lose that, particularly as we don't currently have our bike parking guidelines and requirements quite where I think many of us would like to see them today. And in the permit process, we've been able to push in a more progressive direction than is currently required, and been able to provide guidance as to how to best accomplish what we'd like to see. And so again, unless we're at the same time introducing updated bicycle parking requirements and guidelines, I'd be very hesitant to lose the opportunity to have those discussions with the developers.
And I think, I would also argue that retaining that special permit authority is important, especially if we're potentially reducing setbacks and the impact of the lot lines. I think we need to look at how, and have a hearing process over how an individual project will impact the neighborhood around it, be sure that it's compliant with zoning and that design is appropriate for the neighborhood. We have all these different lots throughout that are non-conforming, that are oddly shaped. It's important to have another set of eyes look at it. I don't think the special permit process is particularly onerous. I think back to a project that we reviewed last year, where just by working with the architect and turning the project onto the sidewalk a little bit better, it feels a lot more appropriate to the neighborhood. I think that's important.
So that, I'll end with like 2 of my wish list things that I'd like you to think about. One is what David mentioned, which was what I mentioned, which is actually putting in some good bicycle parking requirements, which now don't exist. And I'm sure David would be happy to work with you on that, and I would too. The second is we've had quite a number of commercial buildings go up on the corridors we talked about with no residential at all. And I wonder if we could do something about that here. Because right now, we're trying to allow more mixed use, but nothing prevents somebody from taking a parcel there and making it, a CVS or a bank building or something like that with no residential at all. And I wonder if we're missing an opportunity by not including a requirement for residential along with it. I don't know what the answer is, but I would ask the committee to take a look as to whether there's a way to actually do that.
Yeah, that's certainly something we can
So
look
those
at.
are my 2 wish list things related to this.
But yeah, I'll have to mull that one.
We'll
But
have to follow up
absolutely.
on that a little bit more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anything else from the board? We can come back to us after we hear things from the public. So I'm going to open up. This is not a public hearing. We're not going to run it as formally as a public hearing is usually run, but the usual rules will still apply. I'll ask you to raise your hand. I'll call on you. Please stand up, state your name and address for the record. Please keep your comments, brief. Please be respectful to the board and to the presenters here this evening, and we'll get through this as quickly as possible. So, Mr. Gersh.
John Gersh, Kipling Road. So without referencing the master plan, can you please articulate why the people of Arlington should be excited about this? I mean, what is the benefit for the people of Arlington for these changes? Because it's your best pitch.
Well, it's tough to answer that without referencing the master plan, because it is one of the charges of the master plan to look at the business corridors, or the main commercial corridors of the town, Mass Ave, Broadway, and Summer Street, and encourage development. And one of the things that we've discovered as we've gone through the process of the master plan and zoning recodification is that the rules that have been in place for the last 40 years have really stymied any chance at development. And as we've started to encourage things like mixed use, and start to open these things up, we're still finding that there are certain roadblocks to redeveloping a lot of these commercial centers. It's kept buildings from being renovated, demolished, torn down, rebuilt with something that's a little bit more appropriate for the 2010s and the future, whereas in the 1960s and the 70s, that was appropriate. Now we're in a situation where these things are out of date. There's a lot of storefronts for a number of reasons, but one of the things that I know staff has heard here is that the commercial space there on the first floor of these buildings just isn't appropriate for modern tenants, and that's really caused a lot of problems and kept Arlington from getting some of the basic amenities that people moving to town want. It's also impacted the housing stock in town. It's kept us from being able to provide alternative types of housing, more condominiums, more small apartments, things that would allow younger couples to move in, younger families to move in, things that would allow seniors to stay in town and perhaps downsize rather than moving out of town. And it's also impacted the tax base because there's a lot of empty space that's just not drawing a financial benefit for the town. So I'll let Jenny speak to that a little bit more, but that's how I see it.
I think actually you summarized it pretty well. I think we've answered that question.
Okay. Mr. Wagner.
Thanks. My name is Carl Wagner. I live in Edgehill Road, Precinct 11. I'm a town meeting member. I appreciate the work that the committee has done to do this look through, and thank you to the ARB for the work you continually do for us. I've never been to one of your meetings, and personally I hope I don't have to go to one ever again.
We want you here.
I think there is a solemn moral duty in protecting the town and the townspeople and upholding the regulations and the intent of those things, and so I thank you for doing that in the months ahead and in any vote you'll have to make with decisions as things come across your desk. I'm sure complicated things come across your desk all the time. I'm basically here actually because of a building that looks like the one left or right, the mixed-use building that appeared God knows how on Mass Ave near the liquor store near Stop and Shop made me say, oh my God, I can't believe this is legal. How did this happen? And I said that recently the other day, and the wife of the developer said, I'm really troubled that you said that. And I said, well, I didn't say it about your husband, the developer. That's the right of the developer to do what's in the regulations and the laws. The building was the problem for me. So I'm not speaking for all these people. I'm not speaking for the 40,000 that are watching ACMi right now. But I do think that Arlington does not want to increase its density. Get that straight. Arlington does not want to increase its density. In 2015, I voted as a town meeting member for what I thought was a good plan to help out mixed-use, residential, and small buildings underneath them that would be kind of like the Capitol, as was referred to. And I do still support that. But I don't think I voted to increase Arlington's density. As you probably know, we are the second most dense town in all of the state. And we are the 9th most municipal density, including cities and towns. We don't want to be number one. Brookline is number one, unless we get their money. We don't want to be higher than the other cities. On the other hand, I went to a meeting that CHAPA and MAPC had last Thursday because someone said, you should go to this, and I said, okay. And the comments that were being made were, if we increase density, it's going to be so great, and there's going to be cheap housing here. So that's different than the problem that we're hearing tonight, which is we need to increase density so we can have better businesses. They seem to be different approaches, but I would argue that making affordable housing doesn't naturally come from letting developers build more buildings or redevelop residential units. They tend to get double priced, or a third more at least. So I caution in that. The specific thing I would say is, when an existing law or regulation has been made, it should be treated as something that has a high bar before it's overturned. And we've seen 6 or so summary level items here that scared me and maybe scared some other people, maybe scared you in seeing them. reducing setbacks to like what we see on Mass Ave near Stop and Shop. Ugh. Increasing height, reducing the setback of tall buildings, turning Mass Ave into an urban jungle. And specifically, I wanted to just refer, I keep hearing from MAPC and people connected with this that they want to make areas that remind us of main thoroughfares. Well, we don't want to look like the area around Kendall Station. It's a nice thoroughfare, but it's a city. We are a town. We want to stay a town. So I ask you to please consider that, and how town meeting and the voters have to vote for anything that you say yes to, because we do carry it with a higher degree of certainty when we vote on stuff that you say yes to. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Preston.
No. I'm Johanna Preston, 42 Mystic Lake Drive, town meeting member, precinct 9. I'd like to ask the committee to take more time to consider what the impact would be on all of Arlington. And I in particular, notes so I can get through quickly, I particularly like to think about the public schools because I watch their meetings every 2 weeks. And I know that they struggle now with enrollment. Kindergartens, when my daughter went, were 18 children, which is a good number with all the things the teacher has to do. We now have kindergarten classes of 25. One school committee member said at one meeting that in 3 school districts, if someone moved in with triplets, we can't do anything. We don't have any room for them. We can't have 29 kids in kindergarten. So then we have to think about what these multifamily apartments might mean for our planning. It doesn't mean we can never have them, but right now the schools are full. And they keep adding on classrooms, and there's a limit to that. I know Gene Benson said they're all adults, but I know in the Brigham Square building now, which was, built 10 years ago, it sends 40 children to the schools. I know the school department is very, very worried about the Muger development, and they might have 200 children. What are they going to do? What about all these new tax revenues to pay for schools? So someone sent me some studies, and a plethora of these studies found that the impact of new development is that costs outweigh revenues, schooling being the major cost. So I think it would have a tremendous impact on the schools. You have to, maybe they're all adults, but I don't think so. Yeah, but I think we should look at who is residing in all these apartment buildings and what might happen if we have many more of them within the next couple of years. What's going to happen to the schools? Now, I also wanted to look at rental housing. And I looked up, one agency advertises 245 rentals available right now in Arlington. I'm not sure we have a scarcity of rental apartments. That needs to be researched, especially when those large complexes by Alewife are going up. Also, will our businesses really profit by having these apartments? Well, I think you all know the Legacy Apartments in Arlington Center. They have 132 units. We have fewer than before, but we have right now 3 vacant storefronts. There seems to be not an immediate, the number of people who live there have not prevented having empty storefronts. And also we should talk more to the people in Capitol Square. My sense of vibrancy comes that the store owners themselves have organized events and communicate with one another. There's also a movie theater. So as someone said, these new apartment buildings, they said to me, is more a solution looking for some problems. I'll say it was more a solution that may cause many problems. And I think that it's important to be conservative, especially when we see the situation in the art schools. We have no commercial tax base. When I was a co-president of the parents group at Addison, I used to rush down to Harvard Recycling and say, we've got to have those stools, we've got to have those file cabinets, we need those chairs. I'm from Arlington, where we have no commercial tax base. They would give them all to me. But I think to see this as just business or just the way it looks would be very short-sighted. We have to think of the impact, especially on the Arlington Public Schools.
Yes, ma'am. Apologize, I
Hi.
don't know your name.
My name is Ayaka. I'm an Arlington resident for 20 years, 17 Silk Street. I'm also an artist. I was very lucky and fortunate to be able to buy a house, two-family house, 20 years ago in Arlington. And there's no way I could do it now. I'm an artist, I'm a creative person. At some point, I realized my town needs help. I started to get engaged. I joined Arlington Cultural Council because I felt like somebody who comes from Poland, the culture was very important, but what made us very rich. And I felt this town had a great need to revitalize and become a culturally rich place. I've been working at the Arlington Cultural Council trying to, participate in communities, sponsor events that actually will be seeds to create great community. I live on a small street, on Silk Street off Broadway. I love my neighborhood, I know everybody. These are all two-family homes, 30 feet tall. I decided to come here today because recently a really great small business got shut down. Small garage now has been purchased by a developer. And I figure, I'll just look up at the developer's, previous projects. I looked at it, and one of the projects he did was in Brighton, where he purchased a two-story home and proposed to build a 5-story complex of 20 units. It scared me. And I drive through Arlington, and I'm from Europe. We like tall buildings, small buildings. I'm a big person, I like big spaces. I couldn't imagine a 5-story building, 26 units built in a space of 16,000 square feet with 42 parking spaces near my home. There's a facility that helps elderly people, a Leahy Clinic. It's a mixed-use facility. Getting out of my street on the rush hour, it's like playing Frogger. It's always dangerous. The Sunnyside Street that the proposed project is now in process is even smaller street. They proposing to build 50 feet high, maximum density building. It will ruin the place. It will ruin a neighborhood. We are congested city. I think the solution, and that breaks my heart driving through Arlington and seeing closed storefronts, and we have participated in pilot projects trying to install some art. Arlington could use artist buildings. Arlington could use something that would bring people, spark maybe interest, and bring people from the outside. Having more people here would be great, but it will not ultimately benefit the community. I don't have children, but my friends do, and they all complain about how stretched out the resources are. I'm an artist. I don't make much money. My taxes are going up, and I would beg you to consider how you will go forward and consider the fact that some of us want to stay here, want to live here. I want to stay here for decades. People say, why don't you just cash in and move? I don't want to move. I love this town, and I think it's important to consider us who are here to stay, and our money and resources will get put forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Revelak.
Steve Revelak, 111 Sunnyside Avenue in Arlington. Overall, I like this proposal. I think that trying to allow a little more density and a little more growth in what are already our high-density districts makes sense. Mass Ave and Broadway in particular. Two things about this one that I was kind of excited to see when I read them were, with all due respect to the board, I like the idea of allowing a 6-unit building by right. To date, we have never had a by right development option that would trigger our inclusionary zoning bylaw. And this would give us one. It's only an R5 through R7 in the B districts, but it's something. The other thing I was kind of happy to see were the dimensional changes to townhouses. And this is something that I've wondered about when working on the recodification. So we have a district called R4. We call it the townhouse district. but it's got the strictest dimensional requirements for townhouses in any part of the town that we allow them. 30,000 square foot lot limit as opposed to 20,000 in other districts. I was curious, I dug through some of the ARB's records from 1975 when the recodification was all worked out. And I found out why there's, a big restriction there. It was because a vocal group of residents wanted to prevent townhouses from being sited on Pleasant Street, on the section of R4 that's down at the base of Pleasant Street. So it's basically there to keep us from building townhouses in the townhouse district. So I'm glad that's being addressed. And I'm also glad to see that, the idea of adopting dimensional regulations that are consistent with what's already there. That goes back to the parcel analysis that you saw at the beginning of October. I would like to stress that this is a modest proposal. It's just a narrow strip along Mass Ave and Broadway, and to provide some sort of a counterpoint or a different example of something not so modest. Over the weekend, I was looking at a document called Minneapolis 2040. This is a master plan for the city of Minneapolis. And a good chunk of Minneapolis is single-family homes. They're zoned for single-family homes. And they decided to do away with the single-family zoning. So wherever there were single-family homes, you'll now be able to do single-family two-unit and three-unit. The reasons they gave were, by limiting large areas of the town to single-family, it increased housing costs, it contributed to segregation and just general economic inequality. So, but again, back to our proposal. It's modest, but I think it's an important step forward to make, and I look forward to seeing this come in front of town meeting in a couple of months.
Thank you. Ms. Evans.
Cornell Evans, 20 Orchard Place. Thank you all for your work. This is very interesting. But the proposal that we're seeing tonight seems to be focused mainly on mixed use and business development to advance the recommendations of the master plan. However, my understanding is that an equally important part of this work is to meet the demand for housing, which has been laid on eastern Massachusetts of 185,000 units, and that will be a large part of what this is attempting to address. Back in 2016, the MAPC speculated that or suggested that there would be a 10% increase in Arlington's population and was recommending an additional 300 units. So my question is, how many units of that 185,000 is Arlington going to be expected to provide? How many of those units will be affordable? And will those affordable units be affordable in perpetuity? Thank you.
Alexis and Jenny.
Yeah, I mean, you're referring to the Metro Mayor's Coalition Housing Task Force regional goal. There aren't any local goals at this time. We have talked with MAPC, but we have not finalized or worked on any sort of local goal. The only local goal that we have is the one that you referenced in the housing production plan, which calls for us to achieve 10% of affordable housing, that's the whole point of the housing production plan, is to achieve the 40B goal. And so it lays out 100 units per year of the 5-year plan in order to achieve that goal. And it doesn't, so that you're putting the two things together. So in terms of the housing goal with build out of any of this, we would need to explore that. First, we need to know what exactly we're recommending, and then we can actually perform a build out analysis to understand exactly what that impact would be, which would include any potential we would project for affordable units. And then I guess the second part of that is how much of the Metro Mayor's goal is affordable. I guess, again, I'd have to go back to MAPC, and I'm not sure that that's exactly finalized at this point.
Yes. I don't have anything to add. Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you.
That was, yeah.
And just the follow-up of that amorphous number right now, would those affordable units be affordable?
Oh, in perpetuity. I mean, that's what the housing production plan speaks to, is the need to have housing units produced in perpetuity. So we would follow that same line. The same thing goes for inclusionary zoning that's produced through when we get an inclusionary unit, it's supposed to be, allowed in perpetuity. Meaning that the regulation is in effect in perpetuity, which is technically 99 years.
Mr. Warden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. John Warden, 27 Jason Street, town meeting member, precinct 8, senior member of town meeting at this point. If you folks were talking to the residents in the neighborhoods rather than to the handmaidens of developers, you would find that...
That's really out of line, Mr. Ward. Yes.
I'm sorry. I didn't name anybody. You would not find, I believe, any, except perhaps Mr. Redlack, any outcry for we need more density. What you would find is a great concern over tear downs, not only because it disfigures well-established neighborhoods, but also because it the tear downs that are occurring are removing small, affordable, single-family houses that somebody might be able to buy and replacing them with million-dollar-plus houses, which not only have an aesthetic impact upon the neighborhood, but limit the affordability. And both the master plan and the mayor's committee there, conference, whatever, talks about the necessity of limiting tear downs to preserve these houses. These are the affordable houses that are being destroyed. That is what the people of Arlington, I dare say, if you went out and asked them, that's what they like to see dealt with, not an increase in density. If there were institutional memory, you would know that back in the 50s and 60s, the plan was apartments will be the salvation of Arlington. The taxes will go down, everybody will be happy. Well, what they did is they made kind of a mess out of Mass Avenue. They made kind of a mess out of much of Pleasant Street. And did the tax go down? Was everybody happy? No, don't think so. The idea of building 6 units by right is, and a number of you have objected to that concept, is, I mean, if something like Carney's building at Corner Schuler Court can be done under special permit, what would they do if they could do it by right? I mean, it's inconceivable that anything like that could get into our zoning bylaw. The Housing Production Committee, by the way, has not met yet, that I know of. I know my wife
It's
is
the
on it.
Housing Plan Implementation Committee. The
She's never
Housing
been.
Production, the Housing Plan Advisory Committee, which created the Housing Production Plan, met many, many times.
Okay.
Yeah, and the Housing Plan Implementation Committee has met. We just haven't met recently.
Oh, I
So
see.
we've met many, many times, but since Patricia.
Okay, but the
White
point is,
joined,
the
we have
Housing
not met.
Production Plan, as approved by your board and by the Board of Selectmen, particularly, was a basically probably an invalid vote because one of the members was an employee of MAPC, which was pushing the thing, and it was only 3 to 0.
That's not true.
Two absences.
That's not
He
true.
was not a member
No,
of the employee
that's not
of
true that it's invalid.
Hmm?
It's not true that it's an invalid plan. It is a valid plan. It was validly adopted by the town and it was validly approved by the State Department of Housing and Community
I
Development.
see.
I'm going to put that on the record.
What about recusal of people who have an interest
We're not
in
going to
voting?
get.
We're not
not
going to
going
get
talk
into
about
that,
the
but I'm
select board.
making that
Okay.
point. Thank you.
Just saying. Well, I would just ask you to focus on the needs nowadays for the people of Arlington, which do not include putting up a lot of density, building a street wall, or any of that stuff, or limiting parking so more people want to park in the street. And I'd say, and I would ask that you put these plans on the shelf until MAPC and CHAPA can tell us where they're going to put the new school that would be required and who's going to pay for it. Thank you.
Yes, sir. And Mr. Loretti, you're next.
Yes, I'm Mark Rosenthal. I live on Walnut Street. The first thing I want to discuss is process. Because, and I'm going to try and be as polite as I possibly can, but I had lived in Arlington 10 to 15 years before I ever attended any sort of town governmental board meeting, and that was in late 90s or early 2000s. And I've seen a pattern over time that I find very distressing, which strikes me that the people in office, or I'm not sure what the proper term is, but people on a board like this make decisions without discussing it with the populace of Arlington, expect the townspeople, all of whom are busy, to come to meetings that, full well knowing that most won't, and then make decisions, and the first time the general public ever hears about it, it's already pretty much a fait accompli. That certainly seems to have been the case. Just as one example, the decision several years ago with regard to school district buffer zones was sprung on us at the last minute and ran through. And this has happened over and over again. Now, somebody, your name is Jenny? I didn't catch your last name.
It's Rate.
Rate.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let's see. Yeah, you mentioned that you've been working on this for 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
And the general public, for the most part, has no clue that you're doing anything. This engenders feelings among the general public that, these, people running our government.
So there have been
aren't
several
representing
public
it.
meetings, all advertised for the period
That's
of time
not
that the
my
general
point.
public has
That's
the right
not
to
my
attend
point. That's
and
not
the
my
opportunity
point.
to participate in, such as this one, such as the
What-
public hearing that will happen in January.
My point is this: simply holding meetings where where the general public has to learn about it and show up is a virtual guarantee that very few people will. Your first step before you do anything like this should have been to go to all the outlets, whether it's the Arlington Advocate, the Arlington List, email list, the Arlington.
Your Arlington.
Your Arlington.
That should be first.
But
I'd encourage you to get to the point, sir.
You're already 6 months behind the 8 ball because there's a virtual guarantee that most of the general public doesn't know this is happening. And before you started making any plans as to what to do, the step one should have been to discuss it with the townspeople of Arlington and say, we think that the solution to these problems is increased density, and this is what we're going to work on. And the fact that you haven't, if you continue down the path you're going, you are going to have 90% of the town royally pissed off at you.
Thank you.
Well, I'd be glad to just quickly say something.
I think we've heard enough. Mr.
All right,
Loretti.
got it.
Thank
No
you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for taking comments here. Chris Loretti, 56 Adams Street, a former member of the Arlington Redevelopment Board. I want to thank you and the consultant for the efforts on this. Some of the things I agree with. But I think some of the comments of the board really got to the heart of the matter, and that is the reason you have these issues with the height buffer and the need to, or the desire perhaps to change that, is I think you're taking the easy way out. And if you look, there hasn't been enough focus on the zoning map. And you have all of these different zones next to each other, and that's what makes it hard to do the coherent planning. I like the term the rhythm of the corridors. I don't think there's been any discussion or agreement about what the appropriate rhythm is. Several years ago, there was a planning study done by Larry Cox and Associates that said you want this kind of density in the 3 business districts, but not necessarily in between. Yet I also hear about doing mixed use everywhere. There really seems to be this unfortunate infatuation with mixed use. We can't fill a lot of the commercial spaces we have now, as someone said. I mean, do you really want, say, up near the Arlington Heights fire station another business district. I think you really need to think about what you want where in terms of development. It may be entirely appropriate to have 100% residential at various places along these corridors with no mixed use. But I think you need to consider the map either before or in conjunction with this type of analysis. I don't think it makes sense to try to do piecemeal changes to the dimensional requirements of the districts without considering where the various districts are and how you want them to interrelate. Next point, I also appreciate the comments about not relaxing the special permit standards. Virtually all the special permits we were talking about would come before your board and not the ZBA, as I understand it. I would argue on average you probably don't see more than 2 or 3 new special permit hearings each year. And I would suggest, and when I'm done, I'll ask you to ask the longest member of the board, when was the last time this board has ever outright rejected a special permit application? But I'll answer that when I'm done. As to the open space requirements, if you're going to allow 25% on the roof, then effectively you're only increasing that landscaped open space from 10 to 15%. And I would have, in a lot of cases, serious problems with that. Again, if you've got a building like that next to the Capitol Theater, maybe you don't need it. But in other parts of the avenue, the existing old residential structures that meet these types of density requirements already, I would suggest probably exceed that type of open space requirement. Finally, I also want to talk about process, and I appreciate the previous speaker bringing that up. We are now in the second half of December. I find it astounding that these changes are being considered for this year's special annual town meeting. I would say you're about 4 to 6 months behind, at least, in bringing these to the public and generating conversation about them. I realize there may have been meetings, there may have been these MAPC meetings where they do their table exercises with the interested parties and come up with the results that they want. I don't consider that genuine public participation. I don't think that counts. And I would suggest in the past that when there have been changes to the zoning bylaw that have been this extensive, there has been much more public participation earlier on, prior to any formal public hearings. And if any of you doubt that, I suggest you talk to Mr. McClellan, the former planning director who served when most of the major zoning changes took place in the 1970s. So I too agree that I really think you need to slow down a bit, consider this much more broadly, and I think you'll get much more public support and buy-in. But if you try to ram this through now, and I would remind you what happened last year, during the last rewrite, which was supposedly just formatting changes. It was an extremely difficult and drawn-out process, and members of the public, had to offer numerous corrections after the hearing process started. I don't think anyone wants that to happen again. So I think that about covers it. But I would again just emphasize that this has no place going before town meeting this year.
Thank you, Mr. Silvery. Ms. Hallett, and then
Hi, I'm Pam Hallett. I live at Gilboa Road. I'm also a town meeting member from Precinct 21. So there are a couple of items I want to mention. First of all, I'm constantly amazed at how brilliant this redevelopment board is. I'm really amazed that you go ahead, absorb all of this, and come up with the critiques that you do. I'm very impressed, even though I've had to come in front of you on a number of different issues. And nice presentation. I do want to say, though, there are a couple of things that I disagree with that you brought up. The parking, for one thing, there was a survey done of parking, and that was only a year and a half ago, that showed that there was an overabundance of parking. It was not utilized. I know there is a small contingent in town saying there's no parking. Why is that a problem? Especially for, larger residential buildings, when in fact, those are the buildings where the survey was done. And the survey was done over a 3 or 4 day period in the middle of the night, counting excess parking spaces. And I think, you should look at that before you insist that parking not be changed. I also agree that I think the bicycle suggested changes, really, the parking for bicycles really needs to be looked at carefully, figure out what is actually needed and what makes sense, and what can be done in a way that is, assists people in actually utilizing bikes, parking bikes, and keeping them safe, because that's been an issue. The other things I'm really not, I really don't have very much to say about that. But I do want to say to a couple of points here, there have been meetings that have been going on for zoning recodification, housing implementation plans, what kind of housing do you want? What should we do in the district, in the Heights? What should we do in the other districts? I mean, there's so many meetings that I can't even get to them all. And I'm not on all of the committees, but they're out there for anyone who wants to participate. So for this group to come to them and say, I'm sorry, but you haven't done your homework and you haven't done it well enough or far enough and spent enough time, I just think that's really rude and inappropriate at this point. I think you really need to look at minutes. I think they're all out there, and just be real. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Sir.
Hi, I'm Ben. I live at 40 Webb Tower
Full
Road.
name, please.
Benjamin Rudick. Benjamin Isaac Rudick. 40 Webb Tower Road. I'm a new member of the Arlington family. I bought a house here about 8 months ago, 2 weeks before my wife gave birth, so that was terrifying. Got in just in the nick of time. I'm not just new to Arlington, I'm also new to Boston. I'm from Ohio. I moved back from China, where I was for the last 8-9 years. If you want to talk about density, I was living in Shanghai that had 28 million people in an area the size of Greater Boston, so 4 times the size of Massachusetts crammed into something the size of Greater Boston. So I think that I am representing a demographic here that is probably strongly underrepresented at meetings like this. I have an infant, hoping to have more in the future. I have a very understanding wife that would let me come out instead of wrangling a crying baby as I was just before this. And I have to say,
just for the record, me too.
Hey, you got how old? How do you know everyone's name? Do they just all comment the same?
It's a repeat offenders.
Okay, got it. He's really good, and thank you for the presentation. I don't want to talk too long. I'll just say that I personally am a huge supporter of increased density. I heard a comment on a Facebook group that was, changes like these, Arlington's going to turn to Somerville. And that sounds wonderful. Right before here, I was living in Somerville. I think that there are a huge engine of growth, which is the Boston economy, and there's all these great paying jobs. And if we're really worried about the price of our housing going up, the only way to alleviate that is to build more housing. It's just in one out the other. There's no other real variable to work on. Now, granted, we could not build any housing here in Arlington at all and shift all that burden to other places, but those places are attempting to do something very similar. So, and I've also heard concern, Joanne, my neighbor, about schools. I'm planning to send my kids to public schools. I understand that that's going to result in me paying more taxes. I also understand that the house that I live in, which is a perfect example of the single-family teardown that was mentioned previously, actually was a big controversy. There was a tree outside that the developer wanted to tear down, but thankfully didn't. You Google 40 Webb Cowett Road, you'll get 10 pages of... She personally stopped them. When I moved in, I put a big red...
65 people in the neighborhood stopped them.
Right, that's true. And so this was a single-family home. I think it was $800,000 that was bought. It was torn down. They built a very nice duplex, a beautiful, beautiful tree. And now the tax base of that plot of land has roughly tripled. Now, granted, I'm very fortunate that I spent 10 years living in Asia on noodles, that I was able to come back here and buy a home, and a very nice home at that. But I think that in doing that change, in increasing that density of my street, which I think is a similar idea here, you increase the tax base of the town, you brought young families like me. Now granted, you may not want any of us coming at all, in which case Arlington's going to slowly die out, but that is a choice you can make. And if you want housing to be more affordable, just build more housing. And if a few years from now, not Arlington looks like Somerville, but it looks like Kendall, I would say that we're doing a good thing for the greater community. Because while we would like to preserve this character of our small town, people got to live somewhere. and more families like me. Every single house that was sold on my block are people coming from Somerville, and all of them work in pharmaceuticals or whatever. We're the new middle class. That's how much money you got to make to live in this area. And if you want anyone new coming in, you're gonna have to build a lot, and this is just the start. If anything, I would do things much more aggressively than what you're recommending. So that's it.
Thank you.
And you all hate me now. Okay.
Enough. Order.
They're not as pharmaceutical.
If there's any conversation, please take it outside. We still have a significant amount of business to get through. I'm just allowing comment here. In the back, sir.
My name is Neil Longo. I live at 12 Gravel Place in Arlington. I'm an architect. I'm a big supporter also of the density. I think it's really important what you all are considering in terms of how to manage the density and how to properly interface it with adjacent districts and so on and so forth. I'm a little concerned about, or maybe not concerned, I understand this is the first sort of public throwing out of some of these ideas, so I don't feel as much like this is a done deal. I think you're here to listen to comments and take the ideas, so I appreciate that opportunity. I wanted to second, I think it was Mr. Benson and Mr. Lau, also concerns about the juxtaposition along the slice of Mass Ave of different districts, the commercial, mixed use, and so on, and how it feels like more thought needs to happen in terms of those juxtapositions and whether there's really a 15-foot setback or a 10-foot setback, and I think that should be taken into account. I also, I forget now who said it, but I think it's really important to think of this, the buffers and the setbacks, not so much as sort of like an extrusion down Mass Ave of density, and that it's going to be, you know, sort of this continuous extrusion of setbacks, you know, 2 stories, and then there's a buffer that sets back from the rear and so on. I think it's really important to think about what makes Capitol Square, what makes the heights, and so on, and that it's really more of like a slinky snake sort of, you know, in terms of density, in terms of the activity. I think it's important to think of what makes those nodes into active spaces, and that, yes, I think those should have more commercial, and hopefully those commercial spaces will thrive. I think it's unrealistic probably to think of commercial happening all the way up and down Mass Ave. Maybe someday when we look like Shanghai or Taipei or something like that, but in the meantime, I think we need to think of it not as an extrusion of density, but more of a organic growth along nodes. A couple of other things I just wanted to say, thinking about curb cuts, and, you know, we're talking about at least, and I think it's great, one parking space per unit I think it's fine. I'm a bicyclist. I think living right on Mass Ave, you know, there's plenty of opportunities for public transit, but there will be curb cuts, and so just thinking as a sort of as a designer, what is that? We won't so say street wall, but street edge look like? It's not, again, an extrusion, but it's going to have some rhythm to it. It's going to have some breaks, and thinking also about possibility of flexibility to these setbacks. That maybe instead of just like extruding it back or carving back 1 story all the way along, maybe there could be a trade-off that you can go all the way out to the street if you're at the corner, but you can cut back, you know, at the other part of the building to sort of try to balance out that. So we don't end up with all the buildings looking like that, you know, kind of squeezed down Mass Ave. I think that's some flexibility I would advocate for. Let the designers use their creativity to try and find ways, and absolutely special permits and review is important. And I guess my last thing is about landscape space or open space on the roof. I'm not sure who we're trying to please or to satisfy with the open space and landscape space, but it's not going to do much good, in my opinion, for the public if it's on the third floor. I think or on somebody's balcony. I just think that's. I've seen a lot. I think Boston zoning code allows it, and several other zoning codes allow it. And I think it's just a kind of a fake thing. It's like fake news, sort of. I don't like the idea of open space on somebody's roof that the general public can't really see. So.
Thank you. Whoa. One last comment. Yes, sir.
Hi, Larry Slotnick. I live in Precinct 7, town meeting member, 94 Grafton Street. It's my first ARB here at meeting I've been to. I know maybe a couple of you. I appreciate all the work you've done. I support increased density along our major corridors because I think we can all agree that, let's talk about Mass Ave, it's kind of a mishmash and hodgepodge of buildings there, and I'm hoping that through your wisdom you're telling us and telling the town that relaxing some zoning requirements, changing them, will make it less of a mishmash. Make it more vibrant in the areas, in the parts of Mass Ave that have no vibrancy at all. Increase the town's tax base, which I think everyone in the room can agree on that one thing. I personally, just through not really being an expert in this thing, think that the increased number of residential units would tend to not bring as many families with public school-age children. Might bring a different kind of immigrant into Arlington that wouldn't have a severe effect, on the burden of the public school system. Thank you for doing the work you do.
Thank you. I'll take. Yep. Come on in. We'll take one last comment, and then we're going to have to move on because
Charlotte
we're.
Deland, 19 Bellevue Road. I just want to say I'm also a big proponent of increased density, and I hope that I think this seems like very modest changes towards all the goals that we've all been meeting about and agreeing upon for a long time. I hope that we'll consider fewer than one parking space per household. I think that, speaking as a parent of 20-somethings, they don't own cars. They don't want cars. I think our corridor is more than adequate in terms of access to Cambridge and Boston for commuting purposes, and a lot of people don't want to bother with cars. It's not where we're going as a technological society. So,
Thank you.
All
All right, thank you everyone for your comments. We appreciate it. We'll take it back to the committee, which next meets on Jenny.
Actually, what's the next date? I don't think we have one for the multifamily.
TBD.
Yeah, the zoning.
Sometime in
working group has a
2009.
meeting. Yeah.
And the zoning recodification. So, thank you all. If you're going to move, I'd ask you to move. If you have questions or comments, you can email the board or the director. We have several other agenda items on our docket tonight, so I'd ask you to leave quietly, please.
I just had a quick question. There were a meeting of 6 of you that met 3 times.
We disagree,
about
but
this.
that's what civil
Where was
politics is
that
for.
now?
All public meetings, all private meetings are announced on the town website.
But what's the meeting? What is the?
Those 6
Yeah,
meetings
that's
are
gonna be
not,
rough.
those
Yeah.
are not actually, those were working group meetings as part of a project.
Yeah,
So we're actually
real
in the
fun.
middle of our meeting right now. You're free to
Really
email
good
me to
snow
follow
blower.
up. Thank you.
They were not.
No.
No.
They are open to the public.
Your meetings.
No one's following you.
They're all open to the public. We have additional business
Slow
to cover.
creep. And now the people in Lexington are going to be like, we're going to be Arlington. That's what Lexington's saying.
See you, Walter. Good to see you, my friend. You're
Oh, Lombardi, he's a jerk. Yeah.
I'm glad you figured it out.
Oh, I know that. I know that.
Yeah.
It's held up very well.
I like the places, but no, it's a little organic growth. I think organic.
Well, actually, he was taking part that never had a picture.
Oh, yeah.
If you have additional conversations, please take them outside of the meeting room. Unless you want to talk about signs with us.
Let's talk about signs.
You gotta love it.
It's my first.
I'm going to bang the gavel one more time, and then I'm going to have Walter intervene.
You don't want that.
Edit that out.
No, Walter.
You guys talking about signs?
That's funny.
So moving on to the second item on the Erin and Alexis, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Before I move on.
Thank you so much. I
So.
very much appreciate your feedback.
I think you
and
have your
We'll
orders.
mull it over, yeah.
Great glasses.
Yeah.
Really nice.
All right, moving on to sign bylaw analysis. So, then walk out. Jenny, can you walk us through this quickly? Because we're
Actually,
about.
Erin's going to do a quick walkthrough.
Oh, yeah, probably up there. Maybe Joanne. Joanne was right here.
Yeah.
And she drives at that.
Is there a,
It's like
somebody
something
forget
out of
their
Dr.
keys?
Seuss.
Oops.
Somebody dropped their keys?
Car keys?
Joanne?
All right, so Erin,
Erin's
just
gonna walk us
over to you
through
once
very,
you're ready to
very
go. We're gonna go
quickly, just sort of
quickly,
how we
and
got
then
here.
we're gonna talk
Yeah.
about whether we can table
And
other
you all
items here.
have, the analysis, you have that available to read, so we're gonna walk through that. Basically,
Let me back up for a second. Do we need to vote?
so what,
to,
yeah, so what
on
I would.
item 1
Yeah,
to
all right, so-
authorize the department to move forward?
Right, so let me, you wanna close out item 1 first?
Let's close out item 1
Okay.
because we need to vote
So
to
the-
authorize the department to move forward on
Yeah, I mean, you can
recommendations.
vote on it, or I think I heard there's a lot of comments. I think I just need to know that do you want us to continue moving forward with this? If so, we would be coming to the January 7th meeting. We added a meeting so that we could continue the review of warrant articles. The warrant article is really, again, the placeholder language that goes and gets filed in, the actual warrant to town meeting. We would obviously be continuing to work on the actual zoning language. Obviously, there's a lot to grapple with in everything that we just heard, although I would say there were things that we didn't all talk about, which, maybe those things are okay. I don't know, but
So I think this is
so
worth
I think-
continuing to discuss and assess. I don't think we're that far off from a final product, despite timing concerns. I don't have many. The committee is scheduled to meet
The committee is-
sometime to be determined,
Yeah.
but I think that it's fluid enough that they can take the recommendations, the ideas that they've heard tonight from the board and from the public, and come back in January with something that is not far off. We can always opt to put in a warrant article and take no action.
I think for me, it would be helpful if there were some more actual graphics showing some more examples for what's allowed now and what's allowed afterward. The one or two that were there I thought were very good, but there were a lot of changes and it didn't highlight all of them.
So
But I think most of them are probably fine.
The original
and
analysis
necessary,
that we
but
saw back in October
had a lot more.
graphics,
Right.
and those are really helpful to
Right.
see
But-
exactly what's being recommended.
But two things, they weren't at that point connected to what this proposal is.
Right.
And there were places where it was easy to go back to the zoning bylaw and find what was being changed. And there were places where I had a lot of difficulty going back to the zoning bylaw and finding what was being changed. So for me, it would be helpful not only to have more graphics, but to have more cross-references.
cross-reference, okay.
Back and forth to what, the change would be.
That's what
I'm
the
also-
October memo did
Yeah.
talk about, the different sections of the bylaw. I know you
I'm
mean.
also interested in was there actually a survey that did look at apartment buildings?
Yes,
and
there was
can we-
actually,
can
yeah, as
we
part of
see-
our
can-
Arlington Center parking
yeah,
master
can
plan.
Can we see
Yeah.
it? Because,
Sure.
I mean, if there was that survey and it showed that you need fewer than one space per apartment unit, that would probably change my mind.
Yeah.
But I'd be interested
It showed that there was
in
high
seeing it and seeing
underutilization.
what it has to say, because now we allow a lot more, so maybe the answer is somewhere
Yeah.
in between. But I'd be interested in seeing those things too,
All right.
as part of it.
Yeah, no problem.
Andy, Kim, David, any comments?
I feel like we're moving in a positive direction, and I was happy to hear the comments from the public, and I think gave us and MAPC some additional things to think about and some different perspectives. I am a little bit concerned about the timing, given to get this to town meeting, given the apparent level of public interest in this. So I think we have to think carefully about that and proceed accordingly.
I was quite happy with the diverse comments that we got back from feedback here.
Can I just say one thing? It would be helpful if we could get some idea about, if we did these changes and there was maximum build out, what would it really look like? How many more units would there be?
So yeah, we're gonna follow up on that again. Once we have like a solid understanding of what we're recommending, then we are actually talking with different people about how to do that build out analysis and what it would produce in terms of total units, and then that could then help us to back into other numbers, which were questions that people were asking about.
And the studies that you mentioned, I've seen too, and those studies say that the types of houses where the services are greater than taxes tend to be 3 and 4 bedroom houses that have a lot of kids in them. Small apartments, high-end condos, taxes are greater than the services provided. So I think there are ways to talk about that too, but
And
we
these
need
are
to read those
and
reports.
these kinds of housing choices and housing options are the kind of thing that the master plan talks
And-
about.
and
We're
which you
opening
wanna
up a
provide.
diversity
Absolutely.
of
Yeah.
products for people.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
But somehow I think it should recognize this ebb and flow where these nodes that we've identified, the Capitol Theater, downtown, the Civic area, Arlington Heights, are emphasizing the commercial areas, and let it drop off because in between potentially. So how do we address that? Maybe it's just in a map that tells you along the lines of what Gene is saying, what could actually happen. You mentioned that the B4 or something could have the residential in it, one of those business districts. How's that really going to work? Because I think we're not there yet to Beijing. We're not to Somerville yet.
I don't think we want to be Somerville.
No.
We want to be a much better
So
home.
to your point, let that come out, Gene. Let that come out. That we're somewhere in between. So we've got these cool little nodes, and then in between we actually have quite a few blocks that are residential. They're kind of city feeling residential. They're kind of not quite suburban, and then it flows back into big open spaces like Russell House, and then it goes back into density again. So I believe we should let that happen, and if we can demonstrate that somehow in the map, in graphics, I think you'll get people more on board about the soul of Arlington, the feel of Arlington, rather than
And I think
just this kind of discussion of a street wall or people that are like really turned off by it.
I think the way that zoning has been put in place since the 50s and 60s, and the idea that apartments were going to change everything, the zoning that came into play in the 70s was a reaction to that shut off development along those corridors completely. And it's taken us 40 years to get to a point where we can have a discussion reasonably about reconsidering how development works along those corridors. And now we're having that discussion and how we make that work. And how we make
I
that
thought
work.
what was interesting is that the density thing, which I thought at the beginning of the meeting was aiming down a tunnel, actually is a benefit, I think, to be discussed in town meeting. If you agree, we need more density, more tax base, more diversity in population, like the young guys. Okay, this guy's old compared to the people that are going to be moving in.
Yeah.
He's like
And
the old
moving
man.
forward and raising kids and putting kids through the school
I
system.
think we want to call it smart density, not density.
Yeah.
A smart.
Well, it's
oriented
growth.
density.
Right.
It's growth,
Right.
and it's
Smart growth.
you look at going back to the 70s. There was something like 52,000 people in the 1970 census, and we're down to 40 as of 2010.
I think
So
We lost a lot of
54 to
population over
13,000 people
Right.
over the last
Yeah.
4 decades. We can support higher density and growth in
we
town.
certainly can.
So what I'm wondering, just to as like a so we can also get onto the signs, is we're going to start to prepare the warrant article, and then that's what I'm going to bring to the January 7th meeting. I'll do as part of that. We'll also prepare some sort of updated memoranda or something like that that will address some of these issues, and I'll share other things, other documents that were discussed here that you may not have seen previously. They also live, I think, on the website.
Yep.
So we can probably just send links.
Yeah.
So we'll figure out how to do that, but that is what I'm gathering now.
And this
following
meeting on January 10th is going to happen.
Oh, the January 10th meeting was meant to be our forum about this
Right,
topic.
so-
Yeah, we're still going to have that forum, absolutely.
There was a lot more discussion tonight than I think we had anticipated, but I think it was mostly positive.
So, Gene's asked for the analysis of what effect these proposals would have. And I think, Jenny, what you've indicated is, well, as the proposals get more solidified, then you'll be able to do the analysis as to what effect they would actually have. What I'm curious about, and I think at least one person in the audience raised this, is if we have some ideas about how many and the types of additional units that we would like to see happen in Arlington, why not kind of come at it from the other direction and make the changes that would result in those numbers and types of units, rather than proposing changes and then doing the analysis to see what effect that would have.
Well, we've done the build-out analysis, though, for select
Yeah.
parcels, and that's what brought us to this analysis.
Mhm.
So doing a build-out analysis, though, for an entire corridor is kind of a bigger ask.
Okay.
And, for part one. Part two is that even in these analyses that we've done, we kind of made, random assumptions about bedrooms and things like that. So it's not going to be like the most precise analysis. I mean, it can only be as best as it can be in terms of like a build out. And I think the main points of the build out analysis are just to understand like, the potential volume of growth, like by units. It would just be about units, and then it would be probably a little bit about taxes. Like what's a guesstimate on taxes that we could potentially generate from any of this?
But I think
that those were like the two of the variables, but we have to still talk about it internally actually.
But that, what you just said is important, and I think
Yeah.
we have to help the public to understand that we really can't prescribe what developers will do. We can kind of establish some boundaries, but within that, the developers are going to do what they want to do. So we can't really so precisely target it. And so that's why we have to do it the way we're doing it.
Well, we could do it the way that you were sort of originally talking about, like if you flipped it upside down. If we had a town-owned parcel that we wanted to think about and explore for redevelopment, we might do what you were suggesting, and then develop the zoning around that. And there are some property owners in town who are looking to do that kind of analysis, but that's kind of a piece by piece approach. So I mean, we are trying to stretch along this belt, if you will, of Arlington. Arlington's belt.
No, that makes sense.
And to have it, I mean, I think the points about how it intersects with the business districts and sort of what that does in terms of the sort of this connectivity. That's kind of the word that I was using in my mind. How it gets broken up and then how you still feel like you're on this connected corridor. I think those are the kinds of design elements that we need to think about. I don't know that still lives in the zoning though. I just want to point that out. Like, I think it's important for us to think about that, but that feels like a design decision that happens that this board typically makes as we're reviewing projects. But we'll look at how we can be responsive to all of the things that came up in some manner, shape, or form, and then I think that's what we'll bring back to you on the 7th, ideally. And then we added the meeting, as you know, on the 16th.
The fellow I don't know, and the architect who've been talking a little bit about, you don't want sort of each building to look the same going down the street. If there's some way to sort of build in that concept, add another provision to the environmental design review that tries to capture some of that.
I think that's going to happen anyway, Gene.
But I think it would be
that
better.
happens just as a function of
does,
the EDR.
But I
yeah.
think it would be better grounded if there was if we could come up with a specific item to add to the EDR for that.
Maybe something to think about as far as our rules and regulations.
Yeah,
The zoning bylaw.
somewhere where we can.
All right. So I think
All right.
we want the department to move on, prepare warrant language,
Okay.
and then we'll continue on with this discussion of the
We'll see
process.
where we're at.
Sounds
Good.
good.
Okay.
Anybody? All right.
Agreed.
Erin, signs, please.
Signs. Here's some good news. Signs.
Signs.
They could be for housing.
Apartment buildings
all
often
different
have
types of
signs
buildings.
and names.
Signs
Some are
for
in
everything.
this. Some are in this. Sorry.
I've spent the last 2 weeks walking around town and looking at signs. I have a lot of things to say about
What
it.
are you talking about?
Yeah.
Signs.
All right.
Actual signs.
Yeah,
Oh.
signs like
So-
I'm part of the sign.
I thought it was an acronym.
All right. Let's let her begin because
Not the movie either.
So, earlier this fall, the town contracted with Lisa Wise Consulting, which is a planning firm that's based on the West Coast, and had actually, our project manager has about 20 years experience in revising and writing sign code and has become sort of an expert on sign regulations across the country. The gentleman's name is Roger Eastman. He and his colleagues produced this analysis and recommendations report, which is a deep diagnosis dive into the sign bylaw section of the zoning bylaw. So similar to what was prepared for zoning recodification, but like only focused on signs. With a specific look towards
content neutral regulation as required out of a Supreme Court case from 2015, Reed versus the Town of Gilbert, which admittedly focused primarily on temporary signage, and the fact that there is a freedom of speech related to signage, and therefore community should not be regulating signage based on the use that the signage is for, or the event that's being advertised, etc. So with that in mind, the consultant prepared this diagnosis report. He joined us for the zoning bylaw working group last week. David was there. He's a member of the working group, which is awesome. Presented this report with a couple of items that even with the staff input, which we provided a significant amount of input to the development of this report. And also, I was remiss in mentioning, I completed with the assistance of other staff members in the department probably close to a dozen stakeholder interviews with a variety of people that are interested or might have something to say about sign regulation in the community. And we also held a workshop in at the end of October where I presented sort of the why we're looking at doing this right now to get some initial feedback. So that sort of stakeholder input is also incorporated into the report. So we had a really productive meeting with the zoning bylaw working group last week. There were a couple of items that we had talked about in the group, which aren't necessarily reflected. Those conversations are not reflected in this report. But I can quickly run through those. If the ARB has specific feedback on those items, I'd love to hear it. I know we're butting up against time, but if there's also general comments on the report, I'd love to hear it now, and would take any feedback that you want me to refer back to the consultant.
Andy?
I generally think it looks good. I like the table of contents, the basic content, that you're separating out permanent signs and the other signs, temporary. I think that the section that you're going to put in, that shows the pictures, the examples, is going to help, if not to clarify, it wouldn't clarify the actual, dimensional restrictions, but it would help engender a more vitality and the idea that we want inventiveness in this thing. We're not trying to stifle.
Right.
I do understand all that Read Act stuff. I didn't understand clarify message substitution. Add a substitution provision that any non-commercial message is substituted for a commercial message. That I didn't kind of get what you were after on that.
Sure. So we briefly discussed this at the zoning bylaw working group meetings. Someone else had asked about it. I think it goes back to the idea of being content neutral, and saying that we're not, the sign regulations can't necessarily regulate the text on the sign. We can regulate time, manner, and place. So there should be an allowance that to be in compliance with the Supreme Court's opinion on these types of regulations, that there could be a substitution of text on a sign that shouldn't necessarily be regulated based on through any sort of bylaw requirement.
It's outside of the signage bylaw, which I get that.
Yeah.
So enforcement or suspension of existing content-based regulations, that's related to that.
Yeah, so in our existing bylaw, there's certain call-outs for like gasoline stations, or of course I'm blanking on all of them right now, but there's for example, there's also totally
moving,
blanking.
moving marquees.
Yeah,
and
thank
so-
you. So there's specific uses that are called out in our zoning bylaw currently that should be altered so that it's more district-based and use-based, based on the recommendation, which he details through some example tables from other communities that he's worked in. And that will be one of the major steps to becoming more content neutral.
And I generally agree with page 26 where it's the staff have confirmed the current process. I get that. That seems right.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I really liked about this is creating some level of predictability,
Yeah.
clarity here
Yep.
by recommending that it live entirely in the zoning bylaw,
Yep.
not the town bylaw.
Right, I thought that was good.
Gene?
Sorry, go ahead.
Do you have extra copies?
I have lots and lots of comments, and I should probably put them in line.
Yeah, I will too. 'Cause
To Erin.
Yeah,
I
that's
dis-
probably
I
the
disagree
easiest.
with
I've got a
some-
copy.
I'll say I disagree with some of the analysis. I disagree with some of the implications of Reed v. City of Town of Gilbert. For example, the reason I remembered movie marquee is they specifically said, no, you can't regulate movie marquees because it's not content neutral. But you can say movie theaters can have marquees and no one else can, but this says the exact opposite, and I think it's wrong. I also disagree with the gasoline station. I think you can say for a specific type of business, here's what you can do. This was the argument the Supreme Court had, right? And that why you had so many different concurring opinions in that case, trying to figure it out. And this is incredibly hard. I would not want to be the person to do this. It is incredibly hard. But I think some of the proposed decisions are not giving us the authority that I think we can have even under the Reed decision. And sort of that bothers me, although I generally liked where they were going on this. A few other things to mention. This allows one sign on a residence, except if it has two facades, then you can have one on each. One sign would be like number 16. Well, I took a walk, just took a walk through my neighborhood. Lots and lots of houses have numbers in two places on the same facade. They not only have two numbers, they have things that say protected by Joe's Security, right? So there's a third sign. Some of them have the signs on the buildings. Some of them have a sign on the fence, which isn't mentioned here. Some of them have the sign on the stone wall in front, which isn't mentioned on here. So I know they're all in violation of the current bylaw that only allows one, but we should fix it. Some of them have two numbers because they're two family houses that have two different numbers. So it'd be like 109 and then 111, both on the same. We need to fix that. Then this doesn't say what the distinction is between temporary and permanent signs. At least I couldn't find it. And I don't know what it is because I took a walk today and there was a Bring Back Father Nick sign that's over 2 years old that's in somebody's yard. Maybe it was intended to be temporary, but it looks awfully permanent to me.
What road was that on?
You know,
There's one right in my neighborhood.
Yeah, there's
it
one.
wasn't
They're
near
all over.
it wasn't in our neighborhood. It was over near Capitol Square. You know, and you know, one of the folks in my neighborhood has had a Black Lives Matter sign up for like 2 years in their window. This fall in the election, one of my neighbors had like every candidate running for every office had the sign, which is a lot more than the proposal, which would allow 40 square feet. So a lot of that stuff I think needs to be fixed in this because it doesn't reflect the reality of what's happening in Arlington. And this doesn't mention murals. I think we should do something about murals on buildings. And other than that, I'll
You mean
give
like
like
just
painted.
No, I know what a mural is, but I mean like, but I
Like-
mean what kind of regulation?
We should either say that people can put up murals and it's not subject to the sign
Okay,
bylaw.
all right, then that's
which is
helpful. Because a
what I
lot, we
think.
have actually had applicants bring up the issue of murals. Can I have a mural
Right.
as an ad? And we've said, no,
Well-
it's not allowed.
Well, you might want to, you know, and that gets to the thing. If you have
Yeah.
murals, you can't do the content. That's
Okay.
the other thing, which I'll say in more detail. I do think we should make a distinction between commercial and non-commercial. I still think there's the ability to regulate commercial more than non-commercial. And the only place where it recognizes that, I think, is where it said, we should say something that we're not giving commercial speech more protection, but it should probably say, you know, we intend to give, it should be the opposite somehow.
Okay.
I'll send you lots of written
Yeah,
comments.
and I would appreciate that.
Yeah.
Can I just jump back to a process comment? Because a couple of people touched on the idea of making sure that the process is clearly stated in the report. At the zoning bylaw working group meeting, David as a member of the ARB and Christian Klein as a member of the ZBA are both on the working group. And there was some discussion about not having this bifurcated process dependent on where the property is. And there was some discussion, and I might even lean towards saying consensus, that the ARB should be in charge of special permits for signage that might exceed what is allowed specifically in the bylaw. And I just wanted to bring that up because that's not necessarily something that's pointed out in this report, but has sort of transpired since the report has been issued. So I just wanted to point that out to the members of the ARB as
For
well.
basically consistency's sake, to have one point of contact as the consistent body that reviews and approves signs.
When it's not the building inspector.
Well, yeah, when it's not the building inspector or the department
Yeah.
with the building inspector, yeah,
I
then it would
I
be
think
one
that-
special permit granting authority.
I think that makes sense, so long as it's consistent with state law.
Oh, absolutely,
Which
yeah,
is-
special permits would have.
All right.
Can I go
Could
one,
have influence.
I'm a little confused about one thing, just
Yeah.
enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
How are we addressing enforcement? And what is,
We have a zoning enforcement officer.
Yeah.
yeah, but, okay.
So-
It's funny because there's a sign now a block from Town Hall that's been up for a long time that violates the current town sign by law because it's one of these flappy signs. And I keep waiting, it's a block from Town Hall. When is it gonna disappear? But it's still there.
Well, it's because
Well, it's not on Grove Street.
Pardon me?
Grove Street is
the
where-
zoning
No, it's
enforcement
not on
officer
Grove
is on
Street.
Grove Street.
It's something that I think that's not a zoning question or a zoning conversation. I think the issue of enforcement is something that we should talk about, but not necessarily as part of sign bylaw changes.
No, but it gets subjective though, because you look at what I want to talk about is like the storefronts. And they put all these things on the window.
Mhm.
Now, is that signage or is that decoration? Is that art? It's
It's signage.
Yeah.
well, I've seen people
For the
argue.
most part, I think it's signage, but it's one of those questions that's left to the enforcement officer to answer and enforce. And given all of the other hats that person wears, unfortunately, that has to come down the list as far as priority.
You could argue that we should, to some extent, tailor the regulation to what we can actually enforce.
Yeah. Yes.
Or what we want to enforce.
Yeah.
We have actually been meeting with inspectional services to talk about these changes. This is not, something that we've done without their input.
That's right.
So,
If I may, one of the goals of this project is to make the regulations easy for the layperson to understand. So that includes consistency across zoning districts, which could in turn assist our enforcement staff so that they're not, on a phone or a tablet trying to figure out what zoning district they're in, and then looking through the regulations, be like, oh, there's this B3 district requirement here, but there's one like 5 pages over here, so that there is some consistency in what they're asked to enforce, and in an attempt to make it more straightforward for the layperson, but also for the not only inspectional services. I mean, our department also goes back and forth on, well, what is the right thing here? So just across the board, usability and readability is an important goal of this, and I think that could benefit much more than just us or someone that has the knowledge or understanding of
Just a journey.
Or just a
evening.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you for your patience.
And
And the good time. What did
This
you
is
think of yours?
I've
Did
never
you
been
love
to a
it?
government meeting before in Arlington.
It's a good choice.
This is fascinating.
Isn't this great?
Johanna's my neighbor.
Yeah. I know, I heard that.
Reading zoning bylaws.
All right. So, any other comments?
Is there a fee that goes with this signage stuff when they apply? Is that just goes back to town coffers, or is it, can we,
Paid enforcement officer.
you know, maybe help out the building department by having someone that's part-time or I don't know. I just don't see that there's enough.
I think that's not something this board can do, although I could recommend that another board
I just see us
take
spending
it
all
up.
this time
Yeah.
making these regulations, and it
And not
just
to have them
it's just
enforced.
it's a bunch of rules sitting on a bookshelf somewhere, and no one's really. And I just
Yeah.
So there is a sign permit fee, like a building permit fee, and then
Mhm.
we also have a permit fee, and they go to our respective departments, the fees. How they're used in the special services, I can't say that they necessarily direct them to a specific staff person or some other overhead.
Well, that's fine. I'm not trying to criticize. I'm just trying
But-
to say we're spending all this time on
Yeah.
this. And
If there is a fee
it's a
associated
nice
with it.
booklet. Great job, okay? But if we're just gonna let it just.
It has to have some teeth.
Yes.
Like anything else.
If anything, consistently across the stakeholder interviews, because they were varied and wide-ranging, enforcement has come up consistently. So it's a companion conversation that needs to happen along with the
And that's
decisions.
a separate issue.
Okay.
Moving on.
Well,
I
so
think.
again.
Oh, so we need to
what-
authorize the department.
Yeah,
to move
again, do
forward.
you, this is where we're at in that, so we had like a timeline.
Yeah.
This is, I don't remember when I came to the board to talk about the scope of work, and you asked for me to come back at a certain point, share the analysis.
Mhm.
That's where we're at right now. The next phase of the project is to, obviously develop the actual amendments to the zoning bylaw as well as the amendment to the town bylaw. That's done by Doug Heim and company. And to obviously prepare the warrant article so that we can move forward with these things. We realize there's other discussions to be had that we have yet to engage in that level of detail. But
I
you
think just
have
as
basically an
far as the
understanding of the
timing issue,
recommendations.
as far as the timing issue goes, I would say yes, do that.
Mhm.
And then we still have plenty of time to hash out the actual, we can put in a broad warrant article.
Yeah.
And then we have time to hash out what the
Right.
actual bylaw recommendation would be.
Okay, because this is essentially a remove and replace of the entire section of
Mhm.
that bylaw. And this is exactly why we didn't do this during recodification because it's so substantive, as you can see.
No, but we were also clear that that was one of the first projects that
And this
would
was
be
the first
tackled.
project we said we would
It's
advance,
a
yes.
remove and replace, but it's also removing things from another part of the town.
Mhm.
Oh,
Right?
yeah,
So
but
is that
that's
a
a-
sep-
that's-
would that be a separate
That's the
warrant
separate,
article?
it's a separate warrant article and a separate process because it relates to the select board.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
And,
But they'll
and
probably be done.
with the exception of one paragraph in the section, in the town bylaws, the section is escaping me, the numbers of it. That is essentially a remove and replace as well. The removal would, because it's already duplicated in our zoning bylaw, that's where that would go, and then there would be the retention of one specific, power that's given to the select board, that it has been identified as a need to keep. And that's detailed in the report, which is also posted online, outside of the ARB's agenda packet for those that are listening or have other interest in it.
Watching on YouTube.
Yeah, in 2 days.
Yeah. All right, so
So is that sound good? Does that
Yes.
sound good?
Yep.
Okay.
I'd like to also include Gene's comments.
When he sends them.
yeah, well, he has
Yeah.
to send them to Aaron and Jenny, and then they can send them to
Well,
us. Just process
We
it.
can do that, sure. I
wise.
guess I would also suggest, if it's possible, we'll ask Roger if this is okay first, but if you want to speak directly with Roger and you did not get a chance to, perhaps we can arrange that, because it seems like some of you might have some more
Mhm.
that you want to process with him about his comments and his approach, and so maybe that would be a helpful thing
Yeah.
to do as a follow-up as well. And then if anybody's interested, you can do that.
Yeah,
Right.
he's super easygoing, so I'm sure I can get that scheduled.
Well,
Like a conference call?
there was one, I mean, I think I'd like to send you my comments and you can decide whether it
Yeah,
makes sense
absolutely.
for me
Yeah.
to sort of have that conversation with him or not. But it also says here, blah, 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 on page 44, a conference call will be scheduled with staff and possibly the town's legal counsel to review any issues that warrant for further discussion.
Mhm.
I wonder if I could be on that call if I'm around.
Was that, did you?
This is on page 44 of the
Yep.
Yeah, we still have some lingering stuff with Doug,
Yep.
so we can find a time maybe if you're around next week.
Well, right, if I'm not around, do it without me. But
Yeah,
if you
no, I
let me know
think-
when it is, I'll let you know if I'm around.
We're planning soon.
I can, I have a standing check-in conference call with Roger. It is scheduled for, not this coming Thursday, but the following Thursday. I believe the date is the 29th. If you'd like to join me on that, I would be happy to.
If you send me
I will.
when it is, I can see if I can do it. Thanks.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Should we table item 3?
I'm just going to do a very, very, very quick.
Okay.
Jean is aware of this. I was going to do an ARB sort of just general update of redevelopment properties.
Mhm.
I really just wanted to focus on bringing two things to your attention. One is the Central School renovation project. We submitted a fairly substantial capital plan request, which is higher than what's in the current capital plan. As you know, we currently only have design money. We've been working with the designer. Obviously not tonight because it didn't work out, but and I think I actually posted the plans for the current plans for the project. But I will make sure that everybody has a copy of everything that's going on next door in terms of the renovation project. What I was starting to say is that Jean serves on the CPA committee and is aware of the fact that I submitted a request for funding through CPA to offset the cost of exterior renovations, basically the repointing of the building and the roof. And I'm also going to be applying for funding through the Massachusetts Historical Commission, through the Mass Preservation Project Fund. So that's the same place that we went to for the Jefferson Cutter House renovations a couple of years ago. So depending upon the outcome of all of these things combined, we are hoping to be able to go out to bid and then eventually start construction in July, August, somewhere in that kind of time window.
If I could just add.
Of course.
So, I think this might be the first year it's true, but it's the first year of the 2 years I've been on the Community Planning Committee, that the proposals add up to a lot more money than we have this year. So we're not gonna be able to fund all the other proposals, and we haven't figured out yet what to do about that.
Yeah. One of them backed out. That wasn't actually.
Pardon me?
One of them actually didn't proceed with
That's
their,
right, but we still have.
their submission, but
still like
there's a lot to
hundreds of
grapple with.
thousands.
Yeah.
I forgot, maybe 500,000, 600,000,
Right.
a lot of money difference.
You had some leftover money from the year before?
That includes leftover money from the
Yeah.
year before.
Oh.
Yeah, so I
Okay.
submitted two proposals, one for Whittemore Park renovations to build off of the planning process that we completed this year for just the phase one, and then I also submitted for this particular preservation aspect to next door. The capital request is a little over $7 million right now, and it'll be something that obviously will be discussed at annual town meeting. And then the second thing that I wanted to bring to your attention is just we have a tenant at 23 Maple Street whose lease will expire in 2020, but I'm in the process of looking at all of the leases and thinking about, looking at the entire portfolio and what, if any, changes might be needed or what it all means in terms of the overall situation with the different properties. And 23 Maple Street is one of those properties that I want to take a very careful look at. And so I may be potentially looking at the sort of assessed value of the property and just really understanding what's the maximum potential that we can get out of that particular redevelopment property.
What square footage is that?
That's a good question. I believe that is about 9,000 square feet, actually. It's fairly large. So, currently used as an institutional use.
Okay.
But it's technically R1. So, those are things that I just wanted to bring to your attention. Glad to answer any other questions. Meeting minutes.
Meeting minutes.
We have minutes basically from November 5th and 7th.
So, begin with the 5th. Fifth, for the most part, looked okay to me. I didn't see anything that jumped out at me, but I might be alone in that. So if anyone has comments or amendments, go ahead. Otherwise, I'll entertain a motion to approve.
You know, I found one thing on one of the 2 minutes and I forgot to write it down.
Oh.
No idea.
I have something on
But
the I have something on the 7th,
Okay,
but
so
it's
maybe
very
that's-
minor.
Maybe that's it.
Okay.
So
Do you have it written? Oh, you're not
Yeah.
done.
Mine, it wasn't wrong, there was just like a random word that didn't belong, so
Oh.
Okay.
that's all.
yeah, that was it.
Are we just on the 5th?
We're on the 5th. Okay. Yeah, good. All right. So I need a motion to approve.
So motion?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Good. So the 7th. The first paragraph, there's an extra R in Michael Burns' name in parentheses there. Like I said,
Deleted.
not a big deal. There's a comma that doesn't belong in the first paragraph. Not a big deal.
Oh, yeah.
And then we'll just move on down. Raise your hand, speak. We'll get through it.
Looks good. I didn't have anything.
Still okay.
David? Did
I
you
had
have
one
something?
clarification. I think it's on page 4, near the bottom, where the paragraph that starts, Mr. Benson suggested 3 licenses. Further along in that paragraph, it says, Mr. Watson stated if they do not allow marijuana facilities in the industrial zone, this would limit the number of facilities. I think that's not quite what I was driving at. I think what I said was that it would, I was trying to say that it wouldn't leave enough potential locations, not that it would limit the number. So if we could just rephrase that a little bit.
To what specifically?
If they do not allow marijuana facilities in the industrial zone, this, oh shoot, I'm not good at editing on the fly.
This would limit the availability of real estate throughout town.
Well, no more spots or locations?
Availability of suitable locations.
Yeah, this would, this would limit the number of suitable locations.
Yeah, you could say number of suitable, locations, stuff, facilities.
Okay.
Yep. Others? Alright. So I have a motion to approve.
So motion with added addendum, added changes?
As amended.
As amended.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. That's it for business.
Well,
We can-
there is
no
one
applause.
last thing, actually, is this official, I know.
Oh, the letter.
The letter,
The
just,
letter.
this
So
is authorizing you to
yeah, so
sign
you
it.
have to authorize either Jenny or me to sign the correspondence from Bob and Nessie about 10 Sunnyside,
Deferring.
continuing to.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All in favor of adjourning the meeting and continuing across the street?
Do
I
we
guess
still
I
have
need a
time?
motion. I don't know if we still
You
have
do.
the time.
I don't know.
We could do it on the 7th. or
Can
the
we,
16th.
why don't we postpone it?
I'll buy you guys beers.
We can't accept.
I can't ask.
I will buy
Thank
myself
you.
a beer. In your,
On our behalf. We can choose another date.
Why don't we choose
January,
another date?
Since it's late.
This is late.
That's
We
okay,
can move to
yes, I
adjourn.
I did my
understand.
will too, yeah.
All right.
All right.
Got a little bit of a
Tryst
headache.
adjournment postponed to January
Postponed.
7th.
So we are